Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords, originally for Xbox and PC, but later re-released on Mac and Linux, as well as Android and iOS. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version, more specifically the somewhat updated Steam release that had some compatibility fixes put in it, as well as Steam Workshop support, which is a slight issue because of the restored content mod, which I had subscribed to on the Steam Workshop and had completely forgotten that I had subscribed to it. So when I reinstalled it for this Redux, I had unwittingly installed the restored content mod along with it. So what you'll be seeing throughout this video is not technically the vanilla version of the game, but that's really not as big of an issue as you might think, for reasons that I will explain a bit later on. Anyway, now that you're aware of what you'll be seeing throughout the video, let's go ahead and actually start talking about it. This is a party-based role-playing game and the sequel to Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Unlike the original game, which was developed by BioWare, this one was actually developed by Obsidian Entertainment and also published by LucasArts, and they actually ended up rushing the game out the door in December of 2004 first for the Xbox, and then a bit later on in February of the following year for PC. The end result was a game that was generally quite well received when it came out, particularly for its story and its characters, but a lot of criticism was directed at it for the pretty hefty technical problems the game launched with. It was a very buggy game on its release, and it remained so for quite a long time. Despite having cut out quite a lot of content to meet the deadline, the game was still in a blatantly unfinished state when it launched, and even though Obsidian patched the game a few times, it was still blatantly unfinished even after they ended official support for it, until the fans decided to get a team together and start working on the restored content mod, which actually did more than just put the content that was hidden in the game files, but not actually in the game, back in, but also fixes quite a lot of the glitches that were left in after official support ended. In fact, the mod is so good at doing both of these things that it's become something effectively essential to playing Knights of the Old Republic 2 these days. So if you take nothing else away from this video, just understand that if you're going to be playing Knights of the Old Republic 2, whether or not I end up recommending it at the end of this, make sure you install the restored content mod. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just start delving right into this game and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, how it is as a sequel to one of the best Star Wars games, if not the best Star Wars game ever made, as well as one of the best role-playing games ever made, and how well it still holds up after all these years. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the exact same engine that powered the original Knights of the Old Republic, the Odyssey engine, and it reuses a lot of the assets from that game, although they did certainly add quite a few of their own as well. The end result is a game that looks very similar to the original Knights of the Old Republic, so much so that if you're a casual observer, you may not be able to tell a difference between the two. But if you start comparing the two directly, you'll notice things like the additional animations that are in Knights of the Old Republic 2, as well as, of course, things like the extra equipment, the redesign to the robes being much more like the prequel films than the rather svelte kind of robes they had in Knights of the Old Republic 1. And if you're playing one of the updated versions, you'll notice that the heads-up display has been scaled to properly fit the screen resolutions of modern systems, as opposed to the very, very small interface you saw with the original game. So while you're certainly likely to appreciate things like the extra equipment that's in Knights of the Old Republic 2, as well as the additional lightsaber colors and things like that, the actual visual quality hasn't really changed all that much, and like with the original game, it really hasn't aged very well. Luckily, like with the original game, the sound design suffers no such issues. The sound effects themselves are mostly reused from the original game, although there are a few new ones sprinkled in there, and they all fit in quite well with the Star Wars universe. Although it certainly would have been nice if they had improved some of the explosion sounds so they were considerably less wimpy, but oh well. Then there's the soundtrack, which, much like the original game, is entirely original to Knights of the Old Republic 2, but also still sounds very appropriate for a Star Wars game. What you will notice immediately with it, however, is that it is considerably more somber and darker in tone than what you heard in Knights of the Old Republic 1, which was much more in keeping with the more grand, adventurous feeling that you normally get with Star Wars. And it certainly contributes quite a bit to the tone this game is going for, but we'll get to that more in a moment. Then of course there's the voice acting, which is to a similar quality level as the original game, although in many places it's actually quite a lot better. Sure, there are sour lines here and there, and with the restored content mod, there are some noticeable shifts in quality with it in certain places where it's obvious that content had been removed from the game and then put back in later. And of course, this being a Star Wars game, some of the lines are pretty cheesy, but as I said in the previous video, some degree of cheesiness in Star Wars is expected, and the voice acting overall is really not hindered by any of the issues that it has. They are momentary at absolute worst, and they really don't take you out of the experience. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that at the time would have been lambasted a bit as being too similar to the original game, but has held up a bit better than the original over the years due to the increased variety and the strength of the voice acting in particular. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place about 5 years after the events of Knights of the Old Republic 1. It assumes a light side ending from the original game, and thus the Sith Empire was defeated by the Republic, but while the Sith Empire was defeated, the Sith do still remain, and they have been hunting down the Jedi in the 5 years since Knights of the Old Republic 1, and have nearly succeeded at eliminating them entirely. Also during this time, the Republic has gotten increasingly unstable and basically teeters on the brink of collapse. Enter your character, known as the Jedi Exile, or simply the Exile, who is the only Jedi that had ventured forth to fight the Mandalorians with Revan that returned to the Council to face judgment. This is where the name the Exile comes in, because the Council deems them unworthy of being a Jedi and banishes them from the Order, of course demanding that they surrender their lightsaber in the process. The Exile had surrendered their lightsaber, been cut off from the Force, and then banished from the Jedi Order, doing who knows what in the years since then, until they finally wake up on the Paragus mining facility in a Kolto tank. This is where the game begins. You find out very quickly that all of the station personnel seem to have died or disappeared, and the facility has been overrun by hostile droids. Shortly after waking up, you run into a strange old woman named Kreia who clearly has some connection to the Force, and ends up forming a Force bond with you. As you continue wandering around the facility, you'll also find a sort of prison area where you'll find the rogue Atton Rand, and after setting him loose, the three of you will wander around the Paragus facility trying to piece together what happened, as well as try to find a way off of the facility. During this process, you will also run into a familiar face from the previous game, T3M4, the astromech droid that accompanied you on your adventures in that game, and ultimately you all work together to find a way off the facility, which turns out to be the Ebonhawk, the ship that you possessed in the previous game, which is bound to raise some eyebrows. What happened to the protagonist from the previous game? Well, as you end up wandering around the galaxy in Knights of the Old Republic 2, you will find out what happened to them, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. Anyway, in the process of exploring and trying to escape the Paragus facility, you eventually encounter an HK-50 assassin droid, who ultimately reveals to you, if you hadn't pieced together what happened already, that basically everything that happened on the station was an attempt to get to you. You see, despite the Exile not having been a member of the Jedi Order for years, and not having really any connection to the Force at this point, the Exile is mistakenly believed to be the last of the Jedi, and is being actively hunted down by the remaining Sith Lords. This droid is part of those efforts and has been hounding you for quite a while. In fact, there's been quite a lot of collateral damage in its attempts to take you down, and the Paragus mining facility's personnel is the latest example of that. As you continue your attempts to escape the facility, you are eventually forced to go onto a Republic cruiser that shows up at the facility, called the Harbinger, and it's there that you encounter the first of the Sith Lords, Darth Sion, who is basically a crumbling mass of undead flesh who's only held together by the sheer power of the dark side of the Force. After narrowly escaping his clutches and making your way to the Ebonhawk, you're able to eventually escape the facility, but not without destroying the facility in the process, whether that be by simply trying to evade enemy shots, and the shots errantly hitting some asteroids that cause a chain reaction that destroys the facility, or by directly shooting the asteroids yourself and causing that. After escaping the facility, you make your way to Telos, where you are quickly put into custody because Telos is aware of the destruction of the Paragus facility and needs to determine whether or not you were directly responsible for it. And that's where the game's tone quickly starts to become apparent. This is a game that is very heavily focused on the consequences of your actions, whether you intended them a certain way or not. You may not necessarily have intended to destroy the Paragus facility, but that was the end result of you trying to get away from Darth Sion regardless. And you find out almost immediately that because that facility was destroyed, a source of vital resources for the Telos station and the planet reclamation efforts that are going on the surface has very suddenly dried up, meaning that all of the efforts for the reclamation project are in great jeopardy. This is one of the things that Kreia, who by this point has become your effective mentor figure, is trying to teach you, that the Force works in strange ways, to where you can make a decision somewhere that's seemingly insignificant, but because everything is interconnected, it can have long-lasting, far-reaching, and drastic effects. But more about that sort of thing in a moment. Eventually you are released from custody, and you have to find a way off of Telos, except that the Ebon Hawk has vanished, and seems to have gone to the surface. So you need to find a way down to the surface, where you will meet up with another character that will become part of your party, Bao-Dur, who actually knows the Jedi Exile. In fact, he always refers to them as General. He was one of the soldiers who fought alongside the Exile during the Mandalorian Wars. After you link up with him, you eventually make your way across the surface of Telos to an abandoned military facility, and you find a shuttle there that will take you to the place where you think the Ebon Hawk is stored. After surviving some ambushes, you eventually find yourself in the presence of Atris, one of the Jedi Council members who exiled you in the first place, and very quickly your conversation with her turns into a rather heated argument, until eventually the conversation moves in the direction of the Sith, and trying to rally the few remaining Jedi against them. This is where the real meat of the story comes into play, because the main part of the game is wandering around various planets trying to find the various members of the Jedi Council that exiled you, and who are all basically the last remaining Jedi. Depending on whether you're playing more light side or neutral or dark side, you're going to be having different objectives with these people. Either you're going to be trying to rally them together to fight back the Sith, or you're going to be trying to find them so you can take them down yourself out of probably revenge or something. All the while, the Sith are hunting you, and as you wander around the galaxy trying to find all these Jedi Masters, you find out very quickly that the moral ambiguity you saw in the opening stages of the game on Paragus and Telos is going to be a trend throughout the entire game. You see, one of the biggest strengths of this game, and one of its biggest weaknesses by the same token, is that it's basically a deconstruction and very scathing criticism of basically everything that makes Star Wars what it is. From the philosophies of the Jedi and the Sith, to the nature of the Force and its influence on life in the galaxy as a whole, and the idea of light and dark sides of the Force, and whether or not that's even relevant. Hell, even the basic hero's journey idea that you normally see with Star Wars is completely torn apart in this game. It's a deceptively simple story at first that very quickly becomes a lot more complicated as you continue to explore it, and when everything's firing on all cylinders, it is incredibly fascinating. There's a couple of problems with it though. The first is that while the dissection of Star Wars is incredibly interesting, unfortunately, the storytelling itself is a bit of a mess. The story is told in a very indirect manner a lot of the time, so a lot of what you're doing is not directly relevant to the actual story, but is still required for you to be able to progress. This is all part of the process of dissecting Star Wars, but at the same time, it does mean that for a more casual player, they're going to be going into this and thinking, why am I doing this? Or, oh, can we just get to the point already? This highlights a pretty pervasive problem with the pacing in the game, which is that there are numerous sequences in the game where it is obviously unfinished and they just had to pad the game out with some bland content. Or you'll get to sequences that simply drag on for way too long, like the entire prologue of the game, from when you start the game on the Paragus facility and all the way up until you get off of Telos. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly some interesting things about the Telos sequence, but the Paragus facility is just an absolute drag to the point where one of the most popular mods for Knights of the Old Republic 2 is the one that lets you skip the entirety of the Paragus facility. Even Terrace in the original Knights of the Old Republic, for all its issues, was nowhere near as boring as the Paragus facility is. Sure, it's important to the plot, and if you're playing through the game the first time, it also serves as the tutorial sequence, so it is important, but once you've played through it once, you're never going to want to play through the Paragus sequence again. The Telos sequence at least is more interesting, but even it has numerous sequences that just feel like padding, so it ends up being a very slow start to the game. And while it gets far better once it finally opens up and lets you go to different locations, it takes so long to get to that point that casual players may not be able to wait it out. And speaking of the casual players, while the die-hard fans of Star Wars and the people who are looking for more cerebral games are going to be able to go through the story just fine, a casual player might find that a lot of it just goes over their head and ends up getting kind of confusing. But by far the biggest problem with the story in the game is simply that it's not finished. They simply rushed the game out to meet the deadline, and while the Restored Content mod does an admirable job of trying to fix a lot of the things that were just missing but were still in the game files, they were still mostly going off of guesswork there, and it's not exactly what the original authors would have intended. Certainly there are a fair few things that the Restored Content mod adds back into the game that were just blatantly missing from the original launch version, and it was not exactly clear why, even when you look at the Restored Content mod version of it in its unofficial form. In the original launch version of the game, there were just certain sequences that ended very abruptly, or you would have certain jumps between situations to where you're like, wait, what just happened? Where did these guys come from? What's going on? And it ended up being an absolute mess. Thankfully, the Restored Content mod does help with quite a lot of this and ultimately makes the game a much more satisfying experience overall than it originally was, but it's still hard to ignore that in its original launch form, and even with the Restored Content mod to some degree, the game just sputters out and is clearly rushed toward the end in particular, and certain other sections of the game are just so full of obnoxious padding that it makes them kind of irritating to play through, like the Narshada sequence, for example. Even with the unfinished nature of the game, however, there is a lot to like in the writing department. I've already talked about how critical it is of Star Wars and how interesting that makes it, but it's in other elements too, like the dialogue in this just generally being a bit snappier and a bit more believable than what you saw in the original Knights of the Old Republic, or the more complex characterizations you get from your party members and even most of the NPCs as well, the more complex situations you find yourself in, with considerably more nuance to the morality in this than what you saw in Knights of the Old Republic 1, where you generally had good guy option and bad guy option, and not much in between. Here, you'll have a whole spectrum of things you can do. So what you end up with in the writing department is something that you really do have to be patient with, but if you are patient with it, you'll find that the high points of the writing completely eclipse anything that was in Knights of the Old Republic 1. But by the same token, there are also elements of the writing that drag the game down even further than what dragged down the original. It is considerably less consistent in that regard, and that ultimately does require a lot more patience to put up with. But while the writing can be a bit of a roller coaster, what about the gameplay? Well, this is still the same fundamental system that powered the original KOTOR. It is based on the D20 3rd edition rules, and for the most part it is a rather solid adaptation of those rules. I've already discussed a lot of the fundamentals of that system in my KOTOR 1 Redux, so I'm not going to go over those here, but suffice to say, all of the stuff you saw in the original game does make a return in KOTOR 2. There were, however, some changes and additions. The first of these changes is that they remove the level cap of 20, so you can actually go above level 20 now, and they also introduced prestige classes, which function a bit differently than they do in the baseline D20 rules. So, to give you an example, in the baseline Dungeons & Dragons rules, prestige classes are basically advanced versions of normal classes that are selectable once you hit certain requirements. They may have certain skill requirements as well as level requirements and so on and so forth, but the requirements for them in KOTOR 2 are much simpler. They simply require you to have particularly high light side or dark side alignment, and to be at least character level 15. Once you've hit that point, then you can go talk to Kreia and she will allow you to go into one of these prestige classes, of which you'll have slightly different choices depending on your alignment. If you are light side alignment, you'll be able to choose between Jedi Weapon Master, Jedi Watchman, and Jedi Master, and if you're dark side alignment, then you can choose between Sith Marauder, Sith Assassin, and Sith Lord. These are basically advanced versions of the basic Jedi Guardian, Sentinel, and Consular classes, although you aren't restricted to one or the other based on whatever your original class was. If, for example, you really want to go from a Jedi Guardian to a Jedi Master, then that's perfectly fine, but you're not going to have the stats from whenever you set up your character that are going to go in well with the Jedi Master class. After all, a Jedi Guardian is really centered around melee combat, while the Jedi Master is more or less a souped-up Jedi Consular that is focused almost entirely around Force powers, meaning that you're going to need a lot of charisma and wisdom to be successful as it. While the prestige classes do change a bit depending on your alignment, they are analogous to one another. So the Weapon Master is roughly equivalent to the Marauder, the Watchman's roughly equivalent to the Sith Assassin, and the Jedi Master is roughly equivalent to the Sith Lord, although obviously your Force power bonuses are going to be different based on your alignment. Unfortunately, there are no neutral prestige classes, so you have to either commit to light side or dark side if you want to use them. And they do give you some additional bonuses and some fairly powerful feats that you'll be able to get exclusively for those prestige classes, so there's definitely a strong mechanical incentive to go either light side or dark side and not stay somewhere in the middle. But you don't have to pick one of the prestige classes if you don't want to. You'll still be able to level up with the base class, no problem. In addition to the prestige classes being added to the game, they also added in a new feature called Lightsaber and Force forms, which allow you to select a sort of passive bonus that you'll be able to have as you go throughout combat. There are 7 lightsaber forms that each give you different bonuses depending on certain situations. For example, Form 1, Determination, or Shi Cho, gives you some extra defense against enemies that are not your direct target, whereas Form 4, the Aggression form or Ataru, gives you some bonuses against your specific target, but gives you penalties against enemies that are not your direct target and makes it harder to deflect blaster bolts. I also mentioned Force forms, of which there are 4, but only one of them is accessible by all classes except for the Jedi Consular and then, of course, its prestige classes. The one that's available to all of the classes is Force Channel, which increases your Force point regeneration as well as some saving throws and Force power damage, but if you choose it, you're using it in place of one of the lightsaber forms, so it's a decision you have to make depending on what enemy types you're fighting and how much you emphasize Force power use. You get similar results with the other 3 Force forms where you select them in place of the lightsaber form or even Force Channel, and they'll give you much more potent but very specific bonuses to certain Force aspects. So for example, Force Potency gives you considerably higher Force power damage, but it costs more Force points to use your powers, whereas Force Affinity allows you to regenerate your Force points during combat at a reduced rate. On top of Force and lightsaber forms, you also gain more Force powers to choose from, and these are both for light side, dark side, and universal powers, so you're not quite as limited with the Force powers as you were in the original game. There are even Force powers you can get specifically for certain classes, or for specifically the main character and nobody else. And of course, on top of all the new Force powers you get, there are also new feats that you can select during level ups, as well as quite a lot of new equipment, including Jedi-specific armors, so you are no longer limited to only robes if you want to be able to cast your Force powers. Now, if you happen to find some Jedi-specific armor, then you can don that and get some actual defensive bonuses, instead of simply having to wear robes and rely entirely on your dexterity score in order to not get hit. In addition to all of that, they also expanded the weapon and armor customization. So now instead of simply having an underlay and an overlay for your armor, you have a variety of overlays and underlays that you can select for your armor that will give you different bonuses. Blasters now have a selection of targeting, power packs, and firing chambers you can select that will all give you different bonuses. Melee weapons have edges, energy cells, and grips, and while lightsabers still have the selection of a color crystal as well as 2 power crystals, they also now have the options of energy cells, emitters, and lenses, all of which give individual bonuses as well. All of this extra customization and all of this extra equipment not only adds some extra complexity to the mechanics, but also gives you some more strategic options. As if that weren't enough, they also expanded the level cap of the game from 20 to 50. Although based on the amount of experience you can actually earn in the game normally, you're probably going to end the game around level 30 or so. You might get up to maybe level 33 if you really push it, but generally speaking it's going to be around level 29 to 30. This is of course a considerably nasty problem for the game's balancing, because D20 is notoriously difficult to balance after about level 18 or so, and by the time you get over level 20 you are dealing with epic levels in Dungeons & Dragons, and by that point you are effectively a demigod. This is of course true for KOTOR 2 as well, and that does mean that by the time you get to really high levels you've basically become Death Destroyer of Worlds, and it does get pretty satisfying. But there is one new mechanical system that will probably give you all manner of trouble throughout the entire game, and that is the influence system. This is a rather dramatic change from KOTOR 1, where it didn't really matter what you did, your companions would stick with you until the end, and only a couple of major decisions would change any of that. In KOTOR 2, on the other hand, your party members will react differently to all the different things you say and do. If you help one person, somebody might like that, but somebody else in the party might not like it. If you just indiscriminately murder somebody, then one party member might like that and another party member might really hate it. And even in the course of a single dialogue, you might gain and lose influence with a given character. Kreia in particular is notorious for this, to the point where she's basically become a meme in the KOTOR community, where you just get this dialogue box that comes up that says, "Influence gained Kreia" and "Influence lost Kreia." Anyway, the basic idea here is that it's a value that explains to what degree you are friends with a given member of your party. High influence levels indicate higher degrees of friendship, and low influence levels indicate more and more degrees of dislike or even outright hatred. The higher influence you have with your party members, the more they'll open up to you about their pasts and their concerns and such, and if your influence gets high enough, then you can even train several of your party members in the ways of the Jedi. It's a very cool idea that fits in very well with the game's overall theme of your actions having consequences whether you intend them or not. Based on your actions, you can either gain or lose influence with party members, and if your influence with them is enough, then you can even push them more towards the light or dark side of the Force. Thematically, that is very cool, and from the standpoint of being able to train your party members in the ways of the Jedi, that is also cool. What's less cool is the actual mechanics of it, which are kinda janky and don't always work very well. Although, to be fair, that could describe a lot of things in Knights of the Old Republic too. I've already talked quite a bit about the way that affects the writing, but even in the mechanical side of things, there's just a general lack of polish, and the amount of glitches that were in the game on launch certainly didn't help. Obviously, now that the game's gotten some patches, as well as the restored content mod fixing a bunch of the glitches, that sort of thing is less of a problem, but you will still occasionally run into some glitches here and there, and if you're playing one of the versions that doesn't support the restored content mod, then you're kinda screwed in that regard, and you're just stuck with whatever fixes they've implemented as a result of basic patching. But while patches and the restored content mod certainly help with the glitches, they don't really do anything about the not particularly well implemented mechanics, like the new crafting system, where you can use chemicals and components to create various useful items, like med kits or repair kits or things like that, and you can also break down items into either components or chemicals. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly a functional system, but it's not one you're going to be using a whole lot throughout the game unless you're just using it to either make a few extra credits from things that you're crafting, or you just happen to need a few extra med packs or something. It's the prime example of a mechanic that sounds pretty good on paper, but just doesn't get a whole lot of mileage in the actual game. But that's the thing about the mechanics of KOTOR 2. They're built on the very solid foundation from KOTOR 1, and that all still works perfectly fine here. It's just that some of the new additions to the existing mechanics aren't quite as balanced as you might hope they'd be, and the new mechanics they added to KOTOR 2 just don't work as well as they really should. But that's not going to be enough to tank the experience, and when you take all of Knights of the Old Republic 2 as a whole, you find that it is still one hell of a great RPG. It's just that it was held back by its unfinished release, and it has never really been able to escape that. And while the restored content mod does certainly help with the unfinished nature of the game, it's not enough to redeem it completely. You still have to be extremely patient with Knights of the Old Republic 2 to really be able to get the most out of it. And that is incredibly frustrating, because KOTOR 1 is one of the very, very few games that I have ever given a 5 out of 5. I consider it an absolute must-own, regardless of whether you're an RPG fan or not. And if Obsidian actually had enough time to finish the game instead of just having to rush it out the door to meet the LucasArts deadline, it very well could have been even better than Knights of the Old Republic 1. But as it stands, it just doesn't have that universal appeal that Knights of the Old Republic 1 manages to pull off. Despite its issues, however, it still manages to land at a 4.5 out of 5 on my scale. It is still something that is an absolute must-play for people who are already fans of Knights of the Old Republic, and especially if you're a diehard Star Wars fan or a diehard RPG fan, you should definitely give it a shot. But you do need to be aware that you're going to have to put up with an awful lot of crap in the game to be able to get to the really good stuff. But if you're a more casual RPG player, you're probably not going to be able to put up with the game's faults enough to get to that good stuff, and especially if you're not a fan of Star Wars, you're probably just not going to be able to get anything out of it at all. Regardless, if after this video you do decide to give the game a try, make sure you install the restored content mod, even if it is only for the bug fixes. Thank you all for watching, and for those of you who have been anticipating these two Reduxes for quite a while, thank you all for being patient with me. But if you think that's the end of the Knights of the Old Republic series on my channel, you would be mistaken, because there is one more game to cover, and I wish it didn't exist. So stay tuned for the My Thoughts On video on Star Wars The Old Republic, which, as I am putting this video together, should be coming out next week. After that, I'm going to be taking a bit of a break from Star Wars games in general, although I am planning on getting Star Wars Squadrons reviewed at some point this year. Not exactly sure when that'll be, but hopefully within the next couple of months. And I'm going to go ahead and get back to working on other stuff in the backlog, as well as some newer games that have released rather recently. So feel free to stick around for those as well, and if you like the kind of content I make on my channel, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or getting more equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.